Hey folks, David Stewart here. So, race swapping older established characters. Is this something that should be permissible or should this be forbidden? Should it be halal or haram? Well, I think it's a little bit complicated to say, but I wanted to make a video explaining some of the stuff. So before I get into it, one of the things that you have to remember is the conflict here is really over the corporate versions of these characters. And these should really be considered fan fiction or on the same level as fan fiction, even if they're not made by fans. That is, they're not official. You have products that are created by original creators, and once those properties get transferred via the magic of corporate IP ownership into the hands of others, changes that those others make should not be considered official. They should be considered on a lower level. Just like how something that exists in the Lord of the Rings movie doesn't in any way replace or add to what was created with J.R.R. Tolkien's original books. That's the way we really should view it. So comics that are coming out with characters that were written by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko, those shouldn't really be considered on the same level as the original works. So let me get that out of the way. I'll do a longer video on that if you like. Here's my general rule. If it is a new adaptation, you can change the race or ethnicity of the character if the race or ethnicity of the character is not essential to that character or the story, meaning it's just a trait. It doesn't have an effect on the plot or the characterization and the way the story plays out. So I'll give you a really good example. I'll give you two examples, actually both from Stephen King. So you have a really good movie, in my opinion, called The Shawshank Redemption. And if you read the original story, Red is white. And in the movie, he's played by Morgan Freeman, who is black. There's a race change. Is this one problematic? I don't think it is. Now, they do actually make light of the fact that Morgan Freeman is playing a character called Red. You have the main character ask him, why are you called Red? And he says, I guess that's on account of me being Irish, which when you see a black man saying that, it seems like a little bit of a joke. Of course, he could be part Irish. But what matters about this adaptation from the story to the movie is that Red's essence of his being is not Irish. He's an American of Irish descent. He didn't grow up in the streets of Dublin. He didn't grow up on the Irish countryside. And he's not spending parts of the story reminiscing about his childhood in Ireland. He happens to be an American of Irish descent. So the main thing is that he's American. And so American could mean several different races, and I think the character is played fine by a black actor, and Morgan Freeman does a great job with that character and his narration throughout the movie. So that race swap isn't a problem, and the main reason it's not a problem is that Red's character is not Irish in some sort of essential way that affects the story, which means that the character could be played by a different ethnicity. Let's look at another Stephen King story that came out recently, which was The Dark Tower. In The Dark Tower, they race swapped Roland Deschain from an explicitly Caucasian character with blue eyes in the books to being played by Idris Elba. Now, Idris Elba is not a bad actor. I don't think he was correctly cast for that, not just because of his race, but because his on-screen presence and attitude didn't match the character in the book very well. I happen to think he's actually a very good actor, but this was not a great part for him. But besides that, was it okay to switch the race in this case? And in my opinion, the answer is no. And that's because not just does the book unambiguously describe Roland as being white. Now, there are characters in books, as my little side addendum here, there's characters in books who are never described as being white, black, Hispanic, or any particular race. Maybe they have dark hair, and that's all the description you get. And so that's not a character that has some sort of explicit ethnicity that's essential to their character, which you can see because otherwise you would know it. But in this case, Roland is explicitly white. He's described as looking like Clint Eastwood, but with bluer eyes, bright blue eyes. But that explicit description is not all there is to it, because there's a character that appears in the second book named Susanna, or who becomes named Susanna. And when she appears, she has a split personality between Odetta, who's a nice lady, and Detta, who's an angry, racist black woman. And she does not like white people. She has a chip on her shoulder for whites, and so she's sucked into this other world with two white men, Eddie and Roland, and this upsets her. obviously. So the tension that arises between these characters is as a result of their racial differences. And so if you were to cast Susanna as a black woman and you had Idris Elba as Roland in the second book, which is called Drawing of the Three, so if you were to make a movie of that, it would seem a little bit weird when she is racist against a black Roland or calls him honky or something like that. So she's a character that explicitly has a racist attitude against whites, and that's part of her character arc and her character growth, is to come to terms with this split personality that's a result of a traumatic childhood experience, actually at the hands of a white person, by the way. So it's something very essential to her being that she's black. You couldn't race swap her. So if you've race swapped Roland, do you put a white woman in the place? And it's like, well, it's a white woman racist against black Roland. Well, that doesn't really work either, because then you end up with a completely different set of societal relationships from where Susanna came from. The fact that Susanna is black is something very important to her being as well. And even as you go further on in the story, she grows white legs because she's being like magically fused with this white woman who's kind of stealing her baby using magic. It's very weird. So you would lose a whole lot of the meaning that King had put behind his characters just by race swapping Roland. He needs to be white so that the dynamics and tension between the characters, if you want to keep it appropriate and true to the story, so all of that is intact. So in that case, it's actually not okay because Caucasian is something that's completely essential to the character. Now, moving on from that, what about things which are not new adaptations, things which are continuations of older material? Like if you are doing a new Amazing Spider-Man comic, right? Spider-Man's a character created by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko. So if you're continuing that, what is your obligation? Could you race swap that? I think the correct answer is no. What you want to do if you are continuing something, again, this is a lower level than official, you want to be as true to the original intentions of the creators as possible if you're trying to continue it. If you're writing something that's intended to be just like fan fiction, bizarre stuff, nobody should take this seriously. You can do whatever you want. But if you're trying to actually continue the Amazing Spider-Man, you need to be true to that character in as many ways as possible, and that includes drawing them in a way that fans are familiar seeing him. When you do all these reboots and you start changing races and changing this and that in the reboots, that's not really continuing what the original creators had done. And so that's a step out of bounds, in my opinion. But again, no matter what, it's still a lower level than official. So if they change Mary Jane to be black, it's still a fan fiction movie. It doesn't really matter. It shouldn't really affect what you're doing. Now, that being said, I don't think there's anything specifically Caucasian about Spider-Man himself. He's specifically American. He's unambiguously American, but he could be played by a black American, as far as I'm concerned. But you're not really dealing with a new adaptation if you were to race swap him to being black. You're just trying to continue what people have done, so you should try to be true to it. Now, I think the big Comicsgate objection is really not to race swapping characters or even changing their genders in ways that that Marvel has done, usually through story methods. Like Thor didn't become a girl; it was a girl took up Thor's hammer or something like that. Anyway, that's not the core complaint of original Comicsgate. The core complaint was the change of the total characterization of these classic characters, which they are continuing and declaring to be an official continuation. Shouldn't be official. It's lower than official because it doesn't involve the original creators. It's basically fan fiction. But because that's a continuation, it should remain true. This includes, changing like Iceman to be gay as being a change that's not true to the original character and design of the original creators. If you wanted to make a gay character, you could design a new one, right? And that's usually been the rebuttal. If you wanted to have a character that was had a specific race or ethnicity, you could create a new one rather than rewriting an older character in a way that isn't true to the original. Changing personalities of older characters It would be, I think, wrong if you were to take Spider-Man and change his motivations, his history, turn him into a more villainous character or a character that's more nihilistic. That would be a deep offense to the original material, and that's kind of what you see with some of the more modern, what some people call SJW Marvel books, is you see a radical change in the way the characters are presented so that they don't have the attitudes and beliefs of their original creation, the original creators. And so that's my general thought on it. It's okay to race swap characters in some circumstances, but generally it needs to be, in my opinion, a fairly new adaptation, and you could probably stretch it past the new adaptation if it's like a reboot, but the race needs to not be something essential about the characters. All right, and if that's reviewing adaptations and things at a lower level than official. So don't race swap characters where their race matters. Go back to Little Mermaid. Little Mermaid is the newest one. Should the Little Mermaid have been recast as a black character? Well, the original tale by Hans Christian Andersen is Danish, right? So it's from a specific geographic location and a specific ethnicity. Given that, should the characters in it appear Danish? In my opinion, I think that they should probably appear to be Danish. Just like how if you were to adapt an African fairy tale, you wouldn't change the characters to be some other race besides African. You'd want to represent what that fairy tale is and means to the culture that it comes from, rather than try to look at it in some greater worldly fashion. And let me just say that I don't think I don't think white girls were any less interested than Princess and the Frog because the main protagonist was black. I don't think, at least in America, because I'm an American, I don't think anyone has problems watching someone of a different ethnicity than them on screen and being able to identify with them. So some of the complaints like, hey, well, they need representation. We need more black representation. It kind of assumes that somebody who's black can't have any kind of identification with somebody on screen who doesn't look like them. That to me seems a little bit racist in itself. Or the idea that a protest to it equals white people want only to identify with other white people on screen or something like that, rather than this argument of you should be true to the original material. Lastly, let me say that, there's arguments over representation. Lastly, let me say that nobody should watch the Little Mermaid reboot. Nobody should be watching any of these Disney live action remakes. There's no reason to watch them. You have the original movie. You can put the Blu-ray into your Blu-ray player and watch it on your TV and enjoy it right now. There's no reason to see a live action remake, especially if you think that it will probably be inferior to the original product. This isn't a new take on a classic fairy tale like I've seen with the Lion King one. It's the same songs. Same thing with Beauty and the Beast. It's the same songs, guys. There's very little added to it, and some of the things that they're adding are going to be pretty cringy. And I'll talk more about some of those maybe in another video. But in general, no, you probably shouldn't race swap Ariel because it's a Danish fairy tale, which means the characters in it are going to be Danes. That being said, though, mermaids are not necessarily Danes, so maybe there's a significant weakness in my argument by thinking that mythical creatures ought to share the same ethnic characteristics as the culture that spawned them. But anyway, that's my opinion on that. Thanks so much for watching this. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I'll see you guys next time. You can get my newest book. I don't have a physical copy of it yet because I haven't published it yet. It'll come out, I think, on July 30th. But you can get a free copy right now, Voices of the Void. So head to dvspress.com/list, and then you'll get an email, and you can read my newest horror book. It's like Aliens meets Cthulhu or something. I'm not quite sure what kind of tagline I'll use. I'll use Aliens meets Lovecraft. You can read that for free. It's about a 2.5 hour read, so like watching a movie. So instead of watching a bad movie, you can read my bad book. You can read my book. I think it's good. So anyway, thanks so much. Leave me your thoughts down below as to these arguments or any other arguments regarding the race change of Ariel in this new Little Mermaid movie. If they really wanted to, they could make new stories, but they don't. There's a reason why they do that. Last argument, and I'll address this in another video. When they say, hey, this is to introduce these stories to a new generation, it's like this new generation doesn't have the Blu-rays. Well, of course they do, and their parents could let them see the Blu-rays and thus introduce them to this. We're not living in the 1950s where there's no such thing as home video. The other thing is, if they really wanted to introduce something to a new generation, they could make something new instead of remake something old. They remake old things specifically because people are already invested in it. They have nostalgia for it. So anyway, that's the last little point I'll make. I'll see you guys next time.